Look at this piece of meat. You sear a $40 ribeye for 20 minutes, and it's glorious. But if you take a $9 chuck roast and try to cut into it after the same treatment, you hit a wall of pure rubber. The strange thing is, both of these cuts are built from the exact same raw materials. They come from the same animal, slide around the same refrigerator drawer, and smell completely identical before they hit the pan. Curious. So how does the cheap cut fall apart on a fork after 4 hours in an oven, while the expensive steak turns to shoe leather if you leave it on the stove for 20 minutes? Here is the secret to the cheap roast. To make that tough meat melt in your mouth, you cannot tiptoe around the toughness. You have to push the internal temperature directly into the exact zone that makes meat tough in the first place. It has to get tougher before it can ever get tender. We aren't trying to gently avoid heat damage. We are deliberately setting off a molecular fight between the proteins happening inside every single bite. To see who is throwing punches, we can look at this cross-section of a muscle fiber. As heat applies, the first protein to react is myosin. Right around 50 degrees Celsius, myosin sets, turning the raw jelly opaque and firm. But its partner, actin, ignores heat until 66 degrees Celsius. When actin finally denatures, it doesn't just firm up, it violently contracts. The physical action inside the muscle fiber is exactly like wringing out a soaking wet towel. Actin physically clamps down, shortens, and forces the internal moisture straight out of the meat. This explains why a medium-rare ribeye is so incredibly juicy. At 60 to 65 degrees, you land in a narrow, optimal texture window. The myosin has set, so your steak is safely cooked, but the actin hasn't yet clamped down to squeeze the water out. A perfectly cooked steak is an exercise in timing. You pull the pan off the burner right before the actin trap is sprung. If that's the absolute rule of cooking meat, it brings us to a massive problem. When you cook a brisket, recipes tell you to take the internal temperature past 90 degrees Celsius. We deliberately shove that meat deep into the exact dry zone we just learned to avoid. We do that because cheap, hard-working muscles bring a third protein into the ring. This is collagen. It forms the connective tissues wrapping the chest and shoulders of the animal, and it is built as a triple-helix rope. It makes the meat difficult to chew. To break that stubborn structural cable down into something you can eat, you have to get it incredibly hot. The bonds won't melt until the internal temperature crosses 70 Celsius. You see the contradiction. To melt the collagen, you must cross 70. But the moment you cross 66 degrees, the actin clamps shut and wrings all the moisture out of your dinner. True tenderness and juiciness are locked behind completely opposing temperature goals. It creates an impossible thermodynamics trap. The way out of this trap relies on how collagen actually behaves. It's a kinetic process, meaning the breakdown responds to the duration of heat as much as the intensity. Time can stand in for extreme temperature. This photograph shows a yak, an animal packed with dense connective tissue. Researchers tested this meat and found that holding it at nearly 60 degrees Celsius for 6 full hours successfully unwound the collagen. This is the science behind sous vide cooking. If you seal a tough short rib in a bag and hold it in a water bath at exactly 60 degrees for 48 hours, the actin never fully denatures, yet the collagen patiently melts away. There is a second requirement for this process to succeed: moisture. You have to braise it, trapping the meat in a covered pot of liquid, because dry heat alone cannot reach the collagen effectively. When collagen unravels in the presence of surrounding water, it undergoes a chemical phase change. The tough, unchewable cables transform into this: gelatin. Gelatin is unique because it can absorb and hold up to 10 times its own weight in water, carrying that moisture right back into the muscle fibers that the actin just squeezed dry. A slow cook acknowledges the inevitable water loss from the actin, but trades that loss for hours of relentless conversion that refloods the meat with slick, rich gelatin from the inside out. Looking at this vintage butcher counter, these different cuts represent varying levels of collagen potential. Choose the meat based on the gelatin it has to offer, rather than the price tag. A pork shoulder is a dense web of connective tissue, which means it will yield massive amounts of gelatin to create perfect pulled pork. A pork loin is entirely lean, so slow cooking it will only leave you with dry chalk. This also decodes the infamous barbecue stall. When these briskets sit in the smoker and their internal temperature completely plateaus for hours, that evaporative cooling is holding the temperature steady while the connective tissue quietly converts to gelatin. We are dealing with two completely opposite approaches to heat. An expensive steak has nothing to break down, so you pull it off the fire before the damage begins. A tough cut requires the opposite. You have to push through the damage. Mastering these cuts means treating that tough armor as locked-up flavor. You use time and moisture to outlast the chemical damage and turn it into the silkiest bite on the plate.